I want to talk to you about a book, the last words of which are just being written at the moment, and it should come out with Princeton University Press this year. And the idea of this book, the reason we wrote this book is because it's relatively uncontroversial, I think, that somehow the internet and social media have something to do with politics at the moment. We're relatively used to the idea that the huge waves of engagement, mobilization, collective action that we've seen across the world that have touched almost every country in the world have something to do with social media, that social media is implicated in some way. But we don't actually know how social media shape collective action. We don't really understand the dynamics of collective action using social media. That's why we wanted to write the book and try and push our understanding a little way. The book's written by Peter John from UCL, myself from the University of Oxford, and my two colleagues, Scott Hale and Taha Yasseri. I'll just say something about where I come from. I'm from the University of Oxford. I'm the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, which is an unusual department of the university because we're a multidisciplinary department. Our mission is to understand life online. I'm a political scientist, so I try and understand political life. But here's some of my beautiful colleagues. Some of them are economists, some of them are sociologists, some of them are geographers. Taha Yasseri, who is a co-author of the book, is a physicist. Scott Hale, the other co-author, there with the sunglasses on, is a computer scientist. We also have a professor of law, a professor of philosophy, right across the whole gamut of academic disciplines. And I think that's important for this kind of research, so I'll come back to that right at the end. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about how we believe that social media relate to political life in the 21st century. I'm going to talk about two types of research that we carried out for this book, one of which is modelling collective action with large-scale data generated from the internet and social media, and then some experiments that we've used to understand the kind of influences at play when people are using social media. And finally, a bit about what kind of model of democracy can encapsulate that change. What democratic model is most useful when we try and think about this change in the round. Just a quick definition of terms. By social media, I mean any internet-based platform that allows the creation and exchange of user-generated content. So that could be Facebook or Twitter or something which allows you to both post content, share content, view things, move on to other platforms and share that with your friends. Or even things like sites which are really set up for the purposes of civic engagement, like a petitions platform, like where you go to sign a petition to the government. So that's quite a broad definition of social media. And by collective action, I mean the standard political science definition of any activity undertaken by citizens with the aim of contributing to public goods. So both quite general definitions there. And before I delve into the research, I wanted to say something about the democratic model that really flagged up in the title of this talk. I should say the book was originally called Chaotic Pluralism, but Princeton University Press, who are publishing the book, didn't like the word chaotic, and they don't like the word pluralism. So we had to think again, which is why we have described the kind of empirical state we observe as turbulent politics, and they like that a bit better. So I imagine that most people in the room are familiar with pluralism, the model that came from American political thought in the 1950s and 60s. Basically, that society and politics is about the many. Society is made up of competing elements, that political institutions and policy making are structured by diversity. For every interest, there'll be a group, and there'll be no monopolistic exercise of power. That was the thinking that informed American political culture and many other political cultures as well. It seems right, the idea that somehow a political world where people have access to media which allow them to start political mobilizations, to participate in all kinds of mobilizations, where it's far easier, far cheaper in terms of time and effort to undertake the costs of participating in politics, that pluralism could be a way to describe it. Of course, since the early days of pluralism in the 50s and 60s, there've been as soon as the ink was dry on those writers' words, there have been a whole host of criticisms, of damning critiques, and revisions of the pluralist idea. One of which was a rather prescient article written in 1998 by Bruce Bimber, a colleague of Philip's and mine, and probably other people in the room, who wrote about the idea that the internet would somehow revive our ideas of a pluralist society and a pluralist state. He returned to that idea in 2003 with his book Information and American Democracy, and the idea of post-bureaucratic pluralism. That's perhaps a pointer to the kind of ideas that we ended up with, although he didn't really return to his pluralist ideas in his later work. And most recently, the political theorist William Connolly has developed a kind of postmodern version of the pluralist model, which I'll say something about at the end. So, obviously, growing proportions of the world are using the internet. We know that, but I just show this graph just to show that we haven't kind of got to any stable state yet. The percentage of the population online across the world continues to rise. Even in North America, where it seemed to have kind of plateaued out in the early part of this, in the later part of the last decade, seems to have received a boost, probably from the usage of internet-enabled phones. In Europe and Central Asia, steady growth. Latin America, Middle East and North Africa, even in sub-Saharan Africa, we are seeing a steady rise of internet usage. And the same applies to social media platforms. Very difficult to get figures for this, actually. But this is the data for just one social media platform, which is pretty popular, Facebook, showing that usage of Facebook, even though we perceive sometimes that Facebook is kind of not fashionable anymore, anybody with teenage children know it's not the cool thing to use at the moment, that's something your boring parents do. Even Facebook is continuing to achieve more and more users, particularly in Asia and regions outside the US and Europe. What I'm trying to say is that increasingly social media they're there in our lives. Almost every indicator of social media usage, the amount of time people spend there, the amount of devices they use to access social media, the usage of social media across the world, almost every indicator of usage is on the rise. Increasingly, as we go about our daily lives, we are somehow spending them intertwined with social media. And as we do that, of course, we get invited to do all sorts of nice things like shopping and listening to music and entertaining ourselves and dating and whatever else people do online. But also we get invitations to participate in politics. And that's really what this research is about, is understanding those, what we call micro donations of time and effort, tiny acts of participation, sharing something, downloading something, liking, following, tweeting, retweeting. All of these we consider to be tiny acts of political participation. And they're interesting acts of participation because they're things that weren't available before. any political scientist in the room will be used to the idea of a kind of ladder of participation. You start off with something small, like signing a petition in the street, for example. That's the conventional way to look at it. Going right through to some kind of dangerous demonstration or street violence or some kind of life-risking activity. Voting, obviously, somewhere in the middle, but people have gone through many dramatic acts of political participation to get the vote. Social media facilitate new sorts of acts right at the bottom of the ladder. They extend the ladder at the bottom end because they reduce the transaction costs of participating relative to the costs of participation. When I talk about a tiny act of participation, I'm really thinking of a tiny act of time or effort, something that doesn't take very much time, doesn't take very much effort. It applies actually, though, to financial donations to politics as well. I'm sure people are very used to the idea that you might pass some demand in the street or receive it via social media or your telephone to give some very small quantity of money to some charitable or political cause. Here you walk along the canal, you're asked to give £3 at perhaps the only moment when you think about canals. That's something that wouldn't have been possible in a previous technological era. £3 to donate something to a political cause. By the time you'd written the cheque, sent it off to an organisation, the chances are you wouldn't get round to it, you wouldn't do it. The transaction costs relative to the participation are high. That's not a totally straightforward idea. Many of my colleagues in political science, and particularly politicians in the British political culture, I'm not sure if the same would be true in Hungary. Perhaps Britain's an extreme here, but in Britain, that doesn't count as politics. Just doing a tiny thing on a mobile phone or a computer is not counting as politics. Politics has to be painful. It has to hurt. It has to involve a long and boring meeting. As the writer Oscar Wilde once said, the trouble with socialism is it cuts so dreadfully into the evenings. And this isn't cutting into the evenings. This is part of everyday life. It's something that can be responded to immediately and participated in immediately. So it's a controversial, it's a controversial idea. Indeed, this quote here is something said by a chair of a parliamentary committee in Britain in response to me giving evidence in 1999. If you describe it in that casual, incidental way that gives a picture of people with a sense of having nothing better to do than press buttons. Actually, I fed that quote back to him in a speech a couple of years ago, and I thought he would be really embarrassed of what he'd said all that time ago and say, but actually when I said it, he was nodding happily. Yes, that was right. So you see, that view is still very pervasive in British political culture and in many other cultures too. But let's run with it, and now I want to show you some data derived from people's tiny acts of participation. These tiny acts are signing petitions. That's a very popular activity on social media. This is data taken from 2 government petition platforms in the UK. One run by Number 10 Downing Street, the second part of the current petition site in the Cabinet Office. Many governments have introduced petition platforms. We the People is the US petition site, many governments, and also many burgeoning array of civic organisations and social enterprises also run petition sites. Many of you use the platform change.org, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And of course, if you do sign a petition online or want somebody else to sign a petition online, then you can immediately disseminate it on social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, any of these social media platforms can easily be used to send off your little act to encourage other people to do it. Interestingly, we have some analytics data now from the UK Cabinet's Office for the petitions platform in the UK, showing that half of all people who visit that petitions platform actually come there via Facebook. Half. Far more than we would have expected. Just showing what an important kind of driver of this particular political act, social media, are. So petition signing is very popular, and if we want to understand it, the good thing about it is that petition signing, like any other political activity using social media, generates huge quantities of data. We scrape the petition platform in the UK every hour, and we have a complete record for every signature on every petition for the last 3 years. We do the same in the US, and we supplement that by drawing down data every night that is geocoded and time-stamped. We've mapped that data. This is a map of all petition signing in the UK. We can map active areas and lazy areas. There's a lot we can do with that kind of data. We can also use it to try and understand the dynamics of the mini mobilizations that form around petitions. What does that data tell us? Well, one of the things it tells us is that most petitions fail completely and utterly. There's a real selection bias in what we know about mobilisation using social media. We only hear about the successful ones, so we tend to think that it's really easy to get 1 million or so people into a square, or a few thousand people to demonstrate against something locally. That is totally not true. Most mobilisations fail completely and utterly without anybody hearing about them. So petitions to the UK platform, 95% of them fail even to get 500 signatures. 99.9% fail to get the 100,000 signatures you need to get a parliamentary debate. And it's not issue-based. It's not that one issue will always will always receive more attention than other issues. We can't find any analytical patterns connected with issues in this data. So in the UK, if you want to find a successful mobilisation, you usually need to look for a cute animal, or at least an animal that can appear cute, like this badger. A lot of political campaigning against the government's policy on culling badgers to reduce the risk of tuberculosis in cattle. This is an example where petition activity has basically been successful. There was a debate in Parliament, 100,000 signatures on that petition number 1 up there. Got a parliamentary debate. The policy has more or less been abandoned here because of scientific evidence, etc. But I mean, it's highly likely that the political activity around the badger cull actually did feed into that decision. So this graph shows in yellow the very few that did manage to get, more than 1,000. The ones at the very top are the 100,000. The 1, 2, 3 there are 3 petitions in favour of stopping the badger cull. The top one got 100,000. The next one got round about 1,000, and the next one got less than 10 signatures. You can see it's not totally issue-based, and you could replicate that over and over again. So most mobilisations using social media don't lead to this. What else do we know about them? We know that, or we can see from this data, that successful mobilisations, those very few, taking the petitions again as an example, successful ones develop very fast indeed. They get going very fast indeed. So these are just the ones, the green ones are the ones that got more than 100,000 signatures, and the brown ones are ones that got more than 10,000 signatures. And now we've got days since creation along the bottom. The black line there is for 30 days. You can see that almost all of them have got there by 30 days. it looks fast. We can model that data, and we have modeled that data for the book. This is a model of collective attention decay of that data, basically showing that collective attention to petitions decays very quickly indeed. This isn't a question of sort of gradual viral spread over time, carefully accumulating in some linear way. If a petition's going to make it, it makes it very quickly indeed. If we've got time along the bottom there and an outreach factor going up the y-axis, what that basically shows, if a petition hasn't made it in 10 hours, it's going to be digital dust. It's not really going anywhere. So speed is of the essence. If a mobilization can get going really quickly, it has a chance of making it. But if it hasn't got, I think it's 3,000 signatures within those 10 hours, it's not going to make it. So the distribution of petitions in this data is distinctly non-normal. It's a distribution which we see over and over again in the internet world, what's called a fat-tailed distribution, meaning that we've got a very small number of extreme events and a very large number of insignificant events, instead of a gentle bell curve of a normal distribution. So the total number of signatures along the x-axis there, and the number of petitions falling into that category on the y-axis. The green is the actual data, and the red, we have simulated what a normal distribution would look like with a far smaller standard deviation. That's what the bell curve would look like. This is what the actual data looks like. A very, very small number of petitions getting a very, very high number of signatures, and along the x-axis, a total number of a very, very large number of petitions getting hardly any signatures. About half of them only get one signature. That's actually a pattern of change which other political scientists have observed in other areas of political life. Again, that's the same data modelled as a daily percentage change of signatures on petitions, again showing a non-normal distribution, a small number of very large changes and a large number of tiny changes. Something modelled by the political scientists Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones in their Policy Agendas project, where they model policy change in liberal democracies. And they identify over and over again these type of distributions, what's called a leptokurtic distribution, with the characteristics that I've described. It's the same distribution as the earthquakes, actually, as the time between earthquakes. Very difficult to predict when the next earthquake's going to be, difficult to predict when one of these mobilizations is successful. So we can see, using that data, using data from a liberal democracy, mobilizations around petitions, as a kind of microcosm for the world of mobilizations. If we do that, we see a pattern which we believe to be repeated over and over again across the world. Large numbers of failures, small numbers of unpredictable and extreme events, which is likely to exert some kind of unruly, unpredictable, disorganized, turbulent influence on political life. And the other sort of method that I want to describe, the other sort of method that we've used in doing this research, is aimed at understanding the nature of that turbulence. And that kind of data is great. I am so pleased that we thought to gather that data, and we are gathering all sorts of other data from social media. Large-scale data, so-called big data, very exciting for political science and all social science disciplines to be able to use this kind of data. But there's a limit to what it can tell us, particularly in terms of any kind of causal patterns or causal inference. And the other kind of method we've used here is gives us more hope of getting that causal inference, and that is experiments, social science experiments, randomized control trials, where we try and get at the bottom of behavior in these mobilizations fueled by social media. And so why do we want to look at those influences? Well, that's because social media exert social influence on people, on individual decision making. If you go onto any social media platform, you've got there's two characteristics of the information environment that may influence your behavior. One of those is that you know what other people are doing. If you decide to follow someone or share something or download something or tweet something, you know in real time how many other people have done that, how popular someone is, how popular a song is, how popular a political issue is, how many people have signed a petition, how many followers somebody has. The internet completely abounds with social information, in a way meaning that political life on social media is qualitatively different from political life in the offline world. If you decide whether to sign a petition in the street, you don't really have any idea who else signed it. The organizer will probably tell you, oh, it's going great, everybody in the country's signing it, you know, but you've only got their word for it, you don't really know. If you sign a petition on change.org, you know immediately how many people have signed, you possibly know how far towards whatever target they have set themselves or what they believe to be the target for change. Social information is everywhere on social media. The other sort of social influence that is exerted by social media is visibility. Again, as never before, we have the chance to have our 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol put it. If anybody thought that visibility, that people didn't want visibility on social media, you only have to look at the concept of the selfie to understand that visibility is a pretty popular kind of idea. Selfies are rather narcissistic form of participation, but even they have been used for political causes and charitable donation. And there's all sorts of ways that if you participate in social media, you can be visible to other people. Again, whether you are visible or not, how visible you are, who you are visible to, where your actions go in social media terms is liable to influence your own behavior. So we've used experiments to look at the effects of those two kinds of social influence, because we believe that they're part of the puzzle, they're part of understanding how mobilizations work. So I'll run through them quickly. If anybody's particularly interested in these, then they're either published or I'm happy to share with people draft chapters of the book that explain these experiments. Starting with social information, here in this experiment, people were shown a number of petitions or political issues, and they were asked to support them. And they were shown varying levels of information about how many other people had signed those petitions. That doesn't mean to say that we lied to them about who had signed it and who hadn't. These were generic petitions for which there were real petitions out there in the real world, and we were able to show them varying levels of information from real petitions. So basically the red bar shows the difference from the control group when people were shown that a lot of other people had signed something, high levels of social information, showing basically that if people were shown that a lot of other people had signed something, they were more likely to sign themselves. That's kind of what we'd expect. If they're shown low levels of information, then they're not more likely to sign, and they may even be less likely to sign. Medium levels of information, more likely to sign, but not statistically significant, actually. The surprise finding from that experiment was people needed to know a lot of other people had done something. It was a simulated experiment, so of course it has problems of external validity and generalization, you know, we can't say for sure, but definitely it seemed from this experiment that people wanted to know that 1 million other people had done something, a really substantive number, before they started thinking that they were going to do it themselves. And that kind of finding has been replicated in other settings. Another way of looking in an experimental way at the effect of social information is via a natural experiment. Because every so often some platform, like a petitions platform or any social media platform, changes. Twitter changes quite often, for example. And that can give you access to a so-called natural experiment where you can test the effect before the change and after the change. We have such a natural experiment in our data because the government, the Cabinet Office changed the UK petition platform in 2012 and introduced trending information, telling people which were the most popular petitions. Actually, the first thing that happened with that is it crashed our crawler because obviously the format of the data had changed, so that was a bit frustrating. But once we've got it going again, we were able to look at the effect of the change. Interestingly, the Cabinet Office had introduced that change because they thought it wouldn't make any difference at all. They did it because they do it in the US and they thought it would be cool and more kind of American to do it, but they didn't really think that it would make too much difference. What we found is that it did make a difference in a quite interesting way. It didn't. Here you can see the average number of signatures per day on the left before and after the change. There weren't more signatures. That's not statistically significant. There weren't really more, or there were a few less signatures after it had changed, but not dramatically so. But what we did find is the concentration, measured with a Gini coefficient, of daily signatures did indeed rise significantly. Basically, the popular petitions got more popular and the less popular petitions got less popular. So it was zero sum that people weren't signing more things, but they were signing the popular ones more. So it was having an effect. It just shows that these platforms, because small changes in these platforms can actually have a significant effect on behaviour, and that's an important thing to think about. Incidentally, I haven't included it here, but we went further into that data and looked at the effect of trending information in different positions, because it was presented on the screen going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we actually found that a finding that will be familiar to anybody from human-computer interaction, that the standard finding that people tend to go down rather than across was borne out by this data. So actually, if a petition gets into position number 1, then that will have a disproportionate effect on its popularity. Also, position number 3. But not so much petition number 2, position number 2, which was over here. Again, small changes to design, an effect on political behaviour. Have you got the time? My watch appears to have stopped.
It's 6:07, so another 10 minutes, 15?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I mentioned the other social influence I mentioned was visibility. We tested this in another experiment, in a public goods game experiment, where we simulated public goods games, and we looked at the effect of both visibility and social information on people's willingness to contribute to public goods. Here, basically, and it would take more than 10 or 15 minutes to go into the details of each experiment. As I say, if you're interested, I'm very happy to share the chapter with you. But basically, what this experiment suggested was that people are more influenced on an individual basis by visibility. If you make somebody visible, they are more likely to contribute. More than social information. Visibility has a greater effect than social information at the individual level. If you make someone visible, that it exerts some kind of shaming influence on people's willingness to contribute. That seemed to be what's going on. But when we looked at the overall kind of goods level in our public goods games, when we looked at the likelihood of the good being provided in a social information and a visibility treatment, we found that social information was more efficient. It was just as likely to provide the good as visibility, but not as likely to raise individual contributions. We argue in the book that we may have seen something like that with the Ice Bucket Challenge. How many people, was the Ice Bucket Challenge popular in Hungary? Yeah? So the Ice Bucket Challenge was a good example of visibility rather than social information being the social influence at work. Because people were visible while they were doing the Ice Bucket Challenge, but you didn't really get that much idea of how many other people were doing it. You knew some of your friends were, there was a general buzz around, and somebody must have nominated you to do it. Well, unless people did it completely voluntarily, but probably not. So there was a shaming mechanism going on, similar to that you get with visibility. But the Ice Bucket Challenge, of course, was criticised quite a lot for inefficiency, for providing sort of supernormal levels of donation to an organisation that possibly couldn't cope with it very well, that couldn't possibly used it in an inefficient way. I mean, these were the allocations. The Ice Bucket Challenge is perhaps an example illustrating how visibility can be inefficient. It can cause people to over-contribute when a good is already provided, for example. That's one of the things we saw in our public goods games. It can cause people to give even when there's no point in giving, even when the good definitely isn't going to be provided. Social information is basically a more efficient way to get people to do things. I think I'm going to move on a bit now and not go into this in too much detail, but just to say the other thing we have tested in the book, which some people might be interested in, is the question of whether personality shapes participation. Basically, if we're looking at very small acts of participation, then we might expect that the normal ways we use to predict political behaviour, i.e. socioeconomic status, demographics, might be less important. If the costs become very low, then your socioeconomic status is perhaps likely to be a less good predictor of whether you contribute or not. And other things might come into play. And that was our reasoning behind exploring the influence of personality in the book. So we ran a number of experiments where we looked how different personalities were influenced by social information and visibility. And we had some quite interesting findings. I'll just mention one of them. Okay, so I mentioned that visibility caused people to contribute more. We were interested, do all individuals contribute more under visibility, or is it certain types of people? One of the things we found there was that it was indeed certain types of people. We used the economists' version of personality, or at least individual level difference, and we looked at pro-self people, or individualists, and pro-social, or cooperative people. We found it was almost entirely the individualists who were shameable. Without exception, all the individualists in our experiment gave more under the visibility condition, and all the and the cooperative people were unaffected or even gave less. Interesting. If you want to target bankers for charitable donations, then best go with visibility. We had other interesting findings like that. I won't go into all the details, but there's a move within political science to use personality as a predictor of political behaviour. And our foray into it with these experiments suggested to us that this is a fruitful line of inquiry in understanding participation using social media. Okay, I just want to summarise that argument and then kind of put some thoughts for the future and the kind of overarching model that we claim to have identified. So we are arguing that micro donations of time and effort, tiny acts of participation are scaling up to large-scale mobilisation. That people deciding whether to participate in those mobilisations are influenced by social information and visibility, which is a less efficient form of providing public goods. Something I haven't talked about, but I'm sure would be a relatively uncontroversial thing to say, is that mobilisations like this seem to be able to get going on the rare occasion where they do get going without leaders, without institutions, without organisations. So from the revolutions of the Arab Spring to petitions in liberal democracies, we've seen whole movements get going without the normal organisational trappings of a political movement. Something which has raised real issues for sustainability, for stability, for how those movements can survive into the future and shape transitions, for example, from autocratic to democratic regimes. That these participation in these mobilisations is shaped by personality rather than demographics, something much more difficult to predict. You can predict, for example, or you can understand the demographic makeup of a locality or a region and perhaps there make assumptions about what political mobilisation will be like there, but you can't look at the personality of a region. So mobilisations made up of these tiny acts of participation, which are open to quite small influences that are routinely exerted by social media, and consist of chain reactions where people decide whether to join based on how many other people have joined and whether they themselves are visible. Quite small influences is, in our view, leading to a turbulent politics, a turbulence in political life, which we are seeing the results of over and over again. So if we were going to look for a model to encapsulate this change, then going back to the model of pluralism that I was talking about right at the beginning, I think we are seeing some elements of what the definition of pluralism used to be. We're seeing something that's more disorganised, more fast-moving, more individualised, less organisationally based than pluralism or any of the revisionist versions of pluralism that came afterwards. Perhaps the nearest it comes to from all the pluralist writers is William Connolly with his postmodern pluralism. And I was interested in particular in this statement that he made in an article in 2008. The emergence of new formations is irreducible to patterns of efficient causality, purposive time, simple probability or long cycles of recurrence. It's written in rather a postmodern way, but it's very reminiscent of what we found here. We found a dynamic system with unpredictable behaviour, high sensitivity to initial conditions, non-linear relationships, high interconnectivity and tipping points. It looks like a chaotic system. It looks like the kind of system, indeed turbulence in fact is an example of a chaotic system, so's the weather. The data that we have and that we have analysed and pulled apart and modelled and experimented on looks like the data from a chaotic system in the natural sciences. And that has a number of implications for how we understand political life. Connolly again, but he's a political theorist working on the sort of cusp of natural sciences and cultural theory, not really kind of trying to develop the methodologies to understand this model. What would you need to do that? Well, I think we do need new ways of using large-scale data to understand social and political life. That is something we did here. what's either called computational social science or data science is going to be an essential and growing part of the social sciences. I believe that's inevitable. We need multidisciplinary teams. Of the 4 authors of this book, Peter John's a political scientist, Taha Yasseri is a physicist, and Scott Hale's a computer scientist, as I said at the beginning. I couldn't do this kind of research without that kind of expertise. That's a real challenge for universities. The University of Oxford is a reasonably sort of multidisciplinary environment. We have the whole college system. People do work together. I may be romanticising it a little bit because we're a multidisciplinary department, so we have quite a kind of privileged position in multidisciplinary terms. But I started my research career at the London School of Economics. I couldn't go and get a physicist to go and work there. I don't think they would be interested in doing that. I understand here that you possibly have some of the possibilities to do that kind of multidisciplinary work, but it's not easy everywhere. But I do think it's necessary to build the kind of models to understand this kind of data. I also think experiments are going to be essential. I believe that large-scale data will be replacing the survey in social science and political science research. Real-time transactional data about what people really did instead of what people thought they might have done or might do or would like. Is that the end? And there's all sorts of ethical challenges in doing this kind of research and working with that kind of data, as the furore over recent experiments at Facebook and other social media platforms has shown, which I haven't really talked about at all. But it's going to be an increasing part of this kind of political science research. This kind of political life raises real questions also for states. I mean, on the one hand, there's also, I believe there to be all sorts of possibilities here for states in terms of better government, of more citizen-focused policy making, of seeing like a citizen rather than seeing like a state. If states could develop the capacity to use this kind of data from social media and their own internal platforms, and civic engagement platforms and all the kind of sources of data that digital life leaves behind, then we could see all sorts of exciting things. That's a quote from Paul Hirst, who was a British pluralist of the mid-90s and an ex-colleague of mine. He wasn't talking about the internet and social media. Actually, Paul had a computer on his desk, but it was never switched on, and he used it only for sticking post-it notes on to remind him of ideas he'd had. But this is a quote from his work, Associative Democracy, where he talked about a continuous flow of information between governors and governed. The kind of data that we're using here and that is increasingly available to governments might allow that continuous flow of information to really come true. Social media could be a sort of barometer of public services, a constant means of self-improvement. And we've been working with some government departments in Britain to try and understand how they could use social media, for example, to understand how citizens are experiencing recent policy changes in the benefits system. And how they might be improved. Likewise, how services might be improved, how citizens could be involved in kind of feeding into policy making. All kinds of possibilities there, but all kinds of challenges as well. One of them is capacity and expertise. Governments and public organisations have really lagged behind corporations in the private sector in understanding, in using big data and using data science approaches to understand society and for self-improvement, and they face the same kind of problems that university researchers do. There's real new kind of ethical dilemmas with using this kind of data, especially with government using this kind of data with respect to citizens. And governments have real reputational challenges when it comes to using any sorts of data about citizens. From the Snowden revelations to the huge kind of data losses there have been, particularly in the UK. Civil servants are always leaving laptops on buses, and I mean, governments tend not to have a very good reputation with using data about citizens, and that's going to be a real challenge too. But there are huge possibilities there for the way that states operate in this kind of world. And finally, I believe that this is going to become more and more important with time. It's quite an interesting question to ask. If you've been going to research the kind of relationship between books and society, when should you have done it? What century should you have done that? I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm pretty sure that now is a good moment to look at this kind of thing. Apart from the fact that we're getting continual, social media platforms are not going to stop. We're not going to stop getting huge shifts of people from one platform to another. Children are always going to think that what their parents are doing is not cool. We're always going to get churn and fragmentation across social media platforms. But more importantly, like that, we're entering an era where, for example, Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, argues that the internet will soon be so pervasive in our lives that it will effectively disappear. That has implications for my department, which happens to be called the Oxford Internet Institute. So we need to think about that. But at that point, when absolutely anything you could do could be interacting with some kind of platform, it could be making some kind of political movement, however small, some act of participation, some sharing or some kind of political act. It's going to be extremely difficult to disentangle that kind of those kind of acts and the kind of influences that work on them. So I think there's a very good argument for this kind of research. We need a kind of research agenda in this area kind of now, rather than leaving it till later. And I'll stop there. Thank you.